Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice. You don't lose to a glacier because it is angry. You lose because it doesn't care. It doesn't care how experienced you think you are, how many people follow your videos, or how many perfect shots you've already captured. Ice has been moving long before you arrived, carving hidden cracks beneath your feet and pulling freezing air down its face with every passing hour. The weather doesn't announce when it's turning against you. It simply does. And by the time you realize the landscape has changed, you've already traded your margin for another minute of confidence. Every warning feels optional until it isn't. Every delay feels harmless until it costs everything. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. What follows is a sad scenario built from patterns that repeat again and again in Alaska wilderness incident reports. The decisions belong to no one in particular, and to almost everyone who has ever stood on ice they didn't understand. Aaron, Dax, Priya, and Marcus, 4 content creators with a combined following in the hundreds of thousands, arrived in Alaska with matching gear, matching itineraries, and the same unspoken belief that had carried them through every other outdoor video they'd ever posted, that nothing had gone wrong yet, so nothing would. They had built careers on looking capable in front of a lens. None of them had ever had to be capable when the lens was off. For Aaron, Dax, Priya, and Marcus, a guided glacier hike would be their last. They didn't come to Alaska to test themselves against it. They came to film it. The glacier was a backdrop first, a landscape second, a hazard a distant third, if it registered as a hazard at all. They booked a half-day guided hike through a reputable outfitter, the kind of company that vets its clients, trains its guides, and turns back long before things become dangerous. That last part would matter more than any of them understood, and it would matter in ways none of them could have predicted while they were still packing bags in a rented cabin the night before. Their guide was a woman named Kessler, 11 years on the ice, the kind of quiet competence that never needed to raise its voice. She'd led hundreds of groups across this same glacier: tourists, scientists, film crews, families. She had seen fear handled well and fear handled badly, and she had learned over more than a decade to read a group within the first 10 minutes of meeting them. She met Aaron, Dax, Priya, and Marcus at the trailhead with a briefing she had given more times than she could count, and she watched them the way she watched every new group, waiting to see who was actually listening. She talked about crevasses hidden under fresh snow, invisible until the moment a boot broke through them. She talked about how quickly the weather over a glacier can turn, even when the valley below stays calm and blue. She explained the turnaround time, the specific hour at which the group would head back regardless of how far they'd gotten, regardless of how the shot looked, regardless of anyone's disappointment. She said it plainly. She said it more than once. She pointed to the wandered route, the thin flags marking safe passage across the ice, and told them to never, under any circumstance, wander past them. They nodded. They filmed her saying it. Dax adjusted his gimbal to get her better in frame. None of them wrote it down. Their confidence didn't come from experience, it came from repetition, from years of standing in front of a camera and being believed. They had summited overlooks, camped in light rain, posted captions about facing the elements, and every time the elements had cooperated. What they had never faced was a place that didn't know they were being watched, a place with no algorithm to reward caution and no audience to punish it. Out here, there was no comment section keeping score. There was only the ice, and the ice kept its own schedule. Indifferent to how many people were following along at home, none of those early decisions were fatal by themselves. Booking the hike wasn't fatal. Filming the safety briefing instead of absorbing it wasn't fatal. Believing quietly that this group was different from the one in the pamphlets, yet more careful, more capable, somehow exempt, that wasn't fatal either. The glacier doesn't need any single choice to kill you. It only needs you to keep making small ones. And it waits with the patience of something that has been waiting since long before your species learned to walk upright for the next one. To understand what came for them, you have to understand what a glacier actually is. Not a frozen backdrop, not scenery. A moving mass of ice, sliding downhill under its own colossal weight, carving the rock beneath it and fracturing under its own tension as it goes. It groans, it shifts. It is, in every meaningful sense, alive with motion, even when it looks perfectly still in a photograph. Alaska's glaciers generate their own weather systems. Even on days when the parking lot sits comfortably warm, the ice field above it can hold temperatures near 32 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 7 Celsius. A cold pocket sitting in the middle of summer, indifferent to whatever the forecast promised down in town. Beneath the surface, the hazards don't announce themselves. Crevasses split the ice in patterns no visitor can read, some of them dozens of feet deep, sometimes bridged over by a thin crust of snow that looks solid and isn't. Moulins, vertical shafts where meltwater plunges into the glacier's interior, can open without warning underfoot, swallowing whatever steps onto them. Meltwater channels cut fast-moving, frigid streams across the surface, deceptively shallow-looking, deceptively strong. Unstable moraine, the loose rock and debris pushed along by the glacier's advance, shifts without notice underfoot. Visibility, clear one moment, can collapse into fog within minutes, erasing the horizon and every landmark with it. None of this is rare. None of this is exaggerated for effect. This is simply what a glacier is every day, whether or not anyone is filming it. Then there's the wind, katabatic wind, cold, dense air sliding downhill off the ice under gravity alone, can turn a calm afternoon into a whiteout in a matter of minutes. It doesn't build gradually the way a storm does in the movies, with darkening clouds and a slow drop in temperature to warn you. It arrives. Guides who work these glaciers every season know this intimately, which is why they turn back before the danger becomes visible to their clients. By the time an inexperienced hiker can see that conditions have deteriorated, an experienced guide has already been watching the signs for 20 minutes, reading the sky the way a sailor reads the sea. The National Park Service is direct about this. Stay with your guide and respect changing conditions, because those conditions can change faster than most visitors expect. Faster than most visitors are willing to believe until they've lived through it once. The National Weather Service Alaska issues the same warning in different language, again and again, in nearly every mountain forecast it publishes. Mountain weather does not behave like valley weather, and it does not give advance notice before it turns. Commercial glacier operators build turnaround times into every guided trip for exactly this reason, not as a suggestion, as a safety margin calculated in advance by people who have watched conditions collapse before, meant to be obeyed before anyone standing on the ice believes it's necessary. The glacier never forces anyone forward. It only removes the options that were ignored earlier. 2 hours into the hike, Kessler saw what she needed to see. The sky over the ridge had thickened to the clean blue of the morning, giving way to a flat, gathering gray. The wind had picked up a degree of bite it hadn't carried an hour before, needling through jacket seams that had felt sufficient at the trailhead. She checked her watch, checked the terrain behind them, checked the ridge one more time, and made the call without hesitation. Turn around, now. This was decision one, and it belonged to her. It was the correct decision made at the correct time by the only person on that glacier qualified to make it. It cost nothing. It required only that 4 people trust the judgment they had, less than 2 hours earlier, been told explicitly to trust. Decision 2 belonged to the group. Dax and Priya had spent the last 20 minutes lining up a shot they'd been chasing since the trip was booked weeks earlier. The 4 of them silhouetted against a crevice field, the kind of image that performs, the kind of image an editor back home would build a whole video around. The light, they told themselves, still looked fine. The sky still looked manageable, if you squinted past the part Kessler was looking at. She was being cautious, they thought, the way guides are paid to be cautious, the way liability made people cautious. They asked for 5 more minutes. Kessler said no. They asked again. Decision 3 was the group dividing. Aaron and Marcus began moving back toward the trail with Kessler, trusting the person whose entire job, whose entire 11 years of experience existed to keep them alive. Dax and Priya stayed behind for the shot, promising to catch up within minutes, framing it to themselves as a small, victimless delay. A group of 4 became a group of 2 and a group of 2, separated by nothing more than a disagreement about how much time actually remained before the weather closed the door behind them. Decision 4 was time itself. slipping away in a way that felt survivable in each individual minute, the way it always does right up until it isn't. The 5 minutes became 10. The light that had looked fine began sliding toward flat and colorless. Visibility, which had been generous an hour earlier, started narrowing at the edges. The distant ridgeline dissolving first, then the nearer hills. The route markers Kessler had pointed out on the way in, thin flagged wands driven into the snow at careful intervals, became harder to distinguish from the surrounding white as the fog began to settle low across the ice. Decision 5 wasn't a decision at all, not consciously. It was cold, working on judgment long before anyone recognized it as cold. This is the part almost no one understands until they've lived it. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself as danger. It presents as irritation, as stubbornness, as a strange, creeping reluctance to hurry, even when hurrying is exactly what the moment demands. By the time Dax and Priya finally packed up and moved to rejoin the others, their thinking had already begun to slow in ways neither of them would have been able to name, let alone recognize in each other. Every failure in this act was small enough on its own to seem forgivable, even reasonable, even smart in the moment it was made. Content was prioritized over the turnaround time that had been stated clearly, out loud less than 2 hours earlier. A guide's direct instruction was delayed instead of obeyed, treated as a starting point for negotiation rather than a fixed rule. Confidence built on an audience's applause stood in for the kind of local knowledge that takes years, not seasons, to earn. Exposure to cold and wind accumulated in minutes that felt individually harmless. A little longer here, a little slower there. And underlying all of it was a failure to appreciate how slowly a glacier crossing becomes once conditions turn. How a walk that took 20 minutes on the way out can take 3 times as long on the way back. When the fog has closed in and the wands are hard to find, and every step has to be tested before it can be trusted, the weather never suddenly becomes deadly. It simply reaches the point where every earlier mistake comes due at once. By the time Dax and Priya caught sight of Kessler, Aaron, and Marcus again, visibility had dropped to perhaps 30 feet. The fog didn't roll in dramatically. It simply arrived, thick and gray, swallowing the ridgeline and then the trail markers and then almost the group itself. Kessler kept them moving, calling out landmarks she knew from memory rather than sight, testing the snow ahead of each step with her pole before trusting her weight to it, counting silently the way she always did when the visibility went bad, tracking distance the only way that still worked. It was Priya who fell, not far, not dramatically. A misjudged step near the edge of a meltwater channel, a slide of perhaps 6 feet down a slick embankment, and then she was in the water, shallow, moving fast, and cold enough that the shock alone knocked the air out of her lungs before she could even call out. Marcus reached her within seconds and pulled her free. It should have been a frightening moment, quickly resolved, a story to tell later with some embarrassment and relief. Instead, it was the moment the day's true danger began, and none of them recognized it as the beginning of anything. Cold water immersion accelerates heat loss at a rate dry cold cannot match. Water conducts heat away from the body roughly 25 times faster than air of the same temperature. Priya's clothing, soaked through in seconds, stopped insulating her the instant it went under, and it kept stealing warmth from her skin with every minute she continued to wear it. Wet fabric pressed against her body like a second hostile layer. The group had jackets, they had a dry base layer or two, packed for photographs rather than emergencies. They did not have time, and they did not have the equipment to fully dry her out on open ice, in wind, in falling visibility with the trailhead still an hour away even under ideal conditions. And these were no longer ideal conditions. What happened to Priya over the next 90 minutes is not unique to her. It is the same physiological sequence that has claimed hikers, climbers, and hunters in cold environments for as long as humans have entered them. A sequence documented in mountaineering medicine again and again, predictable almost to the letter. It began with shivering, violent, involuntary, her body's last effective attempt to generate its own heat through muscle activity, a warning sign that, if caught early enough, still leaves room to reverse course. Then came the loss of dexterity, her fingers fumbling at zippers they'd operated 100 times before, her hands no longer obeying her the way they had an hour earlier, small mechanical failures that should have been read as an alarm and instead were read as clumsiness. Her speech slowed, her pace slowed with it. She began answering questions a bit too late, then not quite answering them at all, drifting instead into short, disconnected phrases that didn't track with what had been asked. This is the stage companions almost always misread, and it is the stage on which most preventable cold weather deaths quietly turn irreversible. It doesn't look like an emergency, it looks like tiredness. It looks like someone being difficult, dragging their feet, arguing that they're fine when they're plainly not moving well, insisting on rest when rest is the last thing their body can afford. Marcus and Dax, neither of them trained to recognize the difference, mistook her slowing responses for stubbornness and her stumbling gait for simple exhaustion. They told her to keep moving. She did for a while because moving was still technically possible, right up until the moment her body's ability to regulate its own core temperature began to fail in earnest. Judgment goes first, then coordination, then eventually the drive to keep moving at all. A dangerous, counterintuitive symptom in which severely hypothermic people sometimes remove clothing they perceive incorrectly as making them too warm. A phenomenon rescuers have documented so often it has its own name. Kessler recognized what was happening before the others did. She had seen it before or trained for the version of it she hadn't personally witnessed. She radioed for help immediately, gave their position as best she could without clear landmarks in their fog, and began doing everything a person can do without proper rewarming equipment on an open glacier in failing light. Insulating Priya from the ground, adding what dry layers existed, sheltering her from the wind with their bodies. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough without help arriving faster than help can arrive on a glacier. In fog, as night comes down over exposed ice. By nightfall, Priya was gone. Not from a fall, not from a crevasse, from cold and from every decision that had delayed her out of it. Decisions made an hour and 2 hours and 3 hours earlier, each one too small at the time to feel like it belonged to the same story as her death. Once survival depends on rescue instead of self-rescue, the mountain has already taken control. Search and rescue in Alaska's glacial terrain does not move the way it does in a city or even in a forest. Fog grounds helicopters that could otherwise close the gap in minutes, leaving rescue teams waiting on weather they cannot control and cannot rush. Darkness strips rescuers of the visual references that make glacier travel survivable in daylight, turning a familiar route into unreadable terrain even for people who know it well. Wind that can knock a hiker sideways can also make helicopter approach unsafe or impossible, forcing rescue teams to travel in on foot or by machine across the same unstable, crevassed terrain that endangered the group in the first place, meaning the rescuers themselves inherit every hazard the victims face, with none of the daylight the victims had at the start. None of this is a failure of the rescuers. It is the terrain doing to them exactly what it did to the people they're trying to reach. Kessler and the others did the one thing that gave the situation any chance at all. They stayed together and they called for help the moment the danger became undeniable, rather than waiting to see if it would resolve on its own, rather than hoping the situation would improve without intervention. Every account of glacier survival tells the same story in reverse. The groups that split up fare worse, the groups that delay their call fare worse, and the groups that remain together and report early consistently improve their odds, even when the outcome is still severe, even when improved odds are not the same as good ones. This composite reflects exactly that pattern, the same pattern documented again and again by Alaska's rescue agencies and the wilderness safety organizations that study these incidents afterward, not to assign blame to the dead, but to keep the next group from becoming a case study in the same report. Guides establish turnaround policies for a single reason. Conditions on a glacier can deteriorate faster than any visitor, however experienced they believe themselves to be, is prepared for. Kessler's turnaround call, made hours before Priya's death, was correct in every particular. It cost the group nothing but a slightly shorter video. It was also, on its own, not enough, because a correct decision, ignored by the people it was meant to protect, saves no one. A warning obeyed too late is functionally the same as a warning never given at all. What remained afterward was not cinematic. It was paperwork and silence and 3 people who had to explain over and over in official statements and quiet phone calls to a family thousands of miles away how an afternoon of content became a fatality. One member of the group did not come home. The survivors carried something back with them that no amount of editing could remove from the footage. The knowledge that they had filmed the exact moment they were told to turn around and kept walking forward anyway. and that the camera had captured, without meaning to, the last few minutes in which everything could still have gone differently. The wilderness does not punish confidence, popularity, or the number of people watching. It simply doesn't recognize them as currency. It recognizes preparation and margin and the willingness to obey a warning before the warning becomes a fact. Long after the ice covers every footprint, the decisions remain painfully clear. When you look back at a tragedy like this one, it's tempting to search for a single catastrophic mistake. The one moment, if reversed, that would have changed everything. The one thing you could point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. But wilderness disasters almost never begin with one decision. They begin with a series of small compromises, each of them reasonable enough in isolation to feel harmless, each of them defensible on its own terms. The chain here could have been broken when the forecast first raised concern, days before anyone stepped onto the ice. It could have ended the moment Kessler explained the turnaround policy at the trailhead, if that briefing had been listened to instead of filmed. It could have stopped when the actual order came to turn back, when the cameras should have been put away without argument, when the group should have stayed together without negotiation, when confidence built on an audience's approval should have yielded instantly and without hesitation to the experience of the one person on that mountain whose entire job was to keep them alive. They weren't trying to die. No one on that glacier wanted anything but a good shot, a good story, a version of themselves that looked braver than they felt back home behind a screen. The glacier didn't punish them for wanting that. It simply remained indifferent while, one small choice at a time, the path back to safety narrowed until it wasn't there anymore, until the margin they'd been spending all afternoon finally ran out. Nature keeps no score. It offers no second chances, and it never negotiates. No matter how many people are watching, no matter how good the light looks, no matter how close the shot is to finished, it only reveals with total and brutal honesty which decisions mattered most, and every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.